Justify. Prove to be right or reasonable. Justification is at the heart of all legal and political argument. But at a time when argument itself is slave to appearances, it is time to bring back a culture of justification. Justify, a podcast on law and politics in India from the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, hosted by Arghya Sengupta.
Welcome to another episode of Justify. As India prepares to go to the polls, this season is dedicated to examining issues of law and policy which shape our nation. Two of the most critical sets of voters in the general elections 2024 will be women and farmers. So it's no surprise that for both these constituencies, a slew of welfare programs have been announced, both by the central government and several states. Yet, the farmers' protests at the borders of Delhi continues to simmer without a clear end in sight. Why is this happening? And how do we understand these issues in light of the upcoming general elections? To understand this, we have Dr. Madhura Swaminathan, Professor and Head of Economics Analysis Unit at the Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore. Madhura holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford and has worked on issues of food security, agriculture, and rural development. Her special interests include working on poverty and inequality, food security, women in work, and education. She has been a member of the Government of India's high-level panel on long-term food security and also served on the Committee of Development Policy of the ECOSOC of the United Nations. So there could really be no better person than Madhura to help us unpack these knotty issues. Thank you, Madhura, for joining us and welcome to Justify.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So let's begin. You were a part of the Abhijit Sen Committee on Long-Term Grain Policy. This is a Government of India committee which had first recommended a statutory MSP. And the question of a statutory MSP is back again with the farm protests. So to what extent do you think a statutory MSP will alleviate the problems that the farmers have been complaining about, and what else might be required?
I think we need to step back for a minute before we talk about the minimum support price and look at agriculture as an occupation. It's one of the riskiest occupations in the world because it's open to the vagaries of nature. And with climate change, with changes in temperature, in rainfall patterns, and sea level rise, and also with the increasing incidence of extreme events, droughts, floods, and so on, the variability of incomes in agriculture is going to rise even further. So I think the starting point we need to know is that a vast majority of those engaged in agriculture today in India, talking very specifically about our context, who are what are officially called small and marginal farmers, that is, they have less than 2 hectares of land, have low incomes from agriculture and variable incomes. Not all households. There is a section making profits from agriculture, but I think this is the context. And as a result of which, agriculture and agriculturists, cultivators, farmers need different kinds of public support. And it is a phenomenon in most countries of the world that there's a huge government subsidy or support to the farm sector. In the EU last year, it was 60 billion euros per annum, or 5 lakh crores for us. And that was going to just 2% of their population who are in farming. So this is the scale of support elsewhere. So to ensure the kinds of food production we want, the kinds of crop we want, and to ensure that those who are growing those crops have some kind of a decent income, I think we need some policies, agricultural support policies. Given that, it happened, I think, historically from the mid-60s, that the way the support was given in India was through the minimum support price. And I think this was very sensible for 2 reasons. One is it was specifically targeted at certain crops. So apart from giving an income support through price, you're also ensuring production of that cost. So we say that's like incentives for specific crops or incentives for specific producers. The second is in a country of our size where we don't know anything. About 50% of our population is rural, and maybe 50% of workers are, we don't have the census number, but 50% are engaged somehow in agriculture. It's very difficult to think of cash or check transfers per month to every farm. So this MSP in this context, I think, is quite a suitable policy. And now we have a historical legacy. And I think it's worth continuing with that and tweaking it as we go along. And it was in this context that the long-term Committee on Long-Term Grain Policy, more than 20 years ago, we recommended that the minimum support price should be statutory, in the sense that, like a minimum wage, it's some kind of a floor price. Uh,
So I'm just
now,
wondering, I'm just going to stop you there for 1 second. And thanks very much for explaining the history of the MSP and the context in which the minimum support price operates. But I just wanted to understand the thinking behind recommending it to be statutory. Was the thinking that there needs to be predictability, that this MSP needs to be given as a matter of law, that it has to be given year on year and should not be left much like everything else in the agricultural sector, to the vagaries of some extraneous conditions, in this case politics, or two, that is the question of the statutory MSP, did that become a relevant question because of the fact that there was perhaps some fear or apprehension that that this would not happen, and if an MSP was not given, then it would lead to deleterious consequences for the sector, or maybe a little bit of both. So could you tell us a little bit more about why statutory MSP?
uh, I think that's a good question, because, and there are two answers, or there are two components of the answer. One is MSP has been announced regularly every year at the start of the Kharif and the Rabi season. So it was not a question of, will the government stop announcing the MSP, but how many farmers actually are able to sell at the MSP? How many farmers are even aware of the MSP? If you look at the official statistics, uh, the last survey we had, the situation assessment survey from the NSS, was in 2018-19. Even in the case of rice and wheat, uh, it's not more than 10-20% of farmers who are aware of MSP, and about the same proportion actually sell to the procurement agencies. So one was a signaling that uh, ensuring a legal basis for this, or a legal guarantee, would mean that there would be increasing awareness, that the state would be forced to buy at that price when prices fall below, or at least farmers would have a right to ask the procurement agencies to buy at that price. And by doing so, the price in the market would be raised, and traders would have to come in and pay that price. So I think the parallel is a little bit with the minimum wage, that not all employers are in India paying it, but that is the aim, is to ensure that at least that is paid, whether it's a private sector or public sector or whoever.
No, that's right. I think that explains it quite clearly, because I actually didn't know that it was only 10 to 20% of farmers who actually sell at the MSP. And if there's a need for a large public awareness campaign actually to talk about the MSP in whichever form it is that it gets announced. But just pushing back a little bit, do you think that the idea of the MSP is also, in some sense, while I fully agree with you that there is need for a minimum wage, and the world over agriculture is supported by some kind of government subsidy program, whether it's in the EU or the US, in most places. But do you also think that maybe it's the case the world over, but more certainly in India, that the MSP is also cover for a sector that is not just uncertain, but also becoming unremunerative? So because I was looking at some data, it's 55% of India's workforce that's involved in farming, but the percentage of GDP now has reduced to about 18% on some recent estimate. So do you think that this MSP debate is sort of a proxy in some sense for a larger debate on how successive governments in India have not been able to ensure uh, that the farm sector is in some sense in good economic health?
I think you're right, Arghya, because what we call the relative productivity per worker, you know, 55% of the population, I believe it's down to 13% now of GDP is from agriculture, but whatever it is. And the remaining 45% are accounting for, you know, 80 plus percent of GDP. So the relative productivity of the worker in agriculture is very low. And I think that is very important. And in all theories of development that we study, the process of development as we understood it would be that workers would leave agriculture while agricultural yields are going up. There would be modernization, mechanization of agriculture, productivity per worker would increase, and more workers would be freed and be able to go and join other occupations, the industrial sector, the services sector. So I think improving productivity in agriculture is a very, very big gap. The other side of the coin is, you need the jobs elsewhere. Maybe we can talk about that later. Where will these workers who are free from agriculture, where will they go? But I think I would say that for making agriculture remunerative, and here I would like to add a point for our young listeners, that for a country the size of India, 1.4 billion now, we can't leave our food security to the vagaries of world trade. And we saw that during COVID too. We need not every crop and but for a large number of crops, which is not just cereal, but pulses and oil seeds and fruit and vegetable, we need to ensure domestic production. So I think that is the starting point. We can't say agriculture is low productivity and forget agriculture. Agriculture is the basis of our food and nutrition security. And a country our size, we need a lot of domestic production. And maybe exports too, as we are exporting basmati and so on now. So given this, we need multiple interventions, and MSP alone is not going to solve the problem. So MSP is one policy that has been in place. And I think the farmers of Punjab and Haryana who have actually benefited from MSP, even this national 10%, when you come to states, there are huge statewide differences. And total procurement, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP used to account for about 40 to 50% of total procurement by the state agencies. So I think they are hanging on to something which they have seen has benefited them. But if we take all agricultural crops and the country as a whole, while we have MSP policy and we continue it, we have to invest in other areas of agriculture. And here I would like to say that, particularly in the context of climate change, at least I believe that R&D is very important. We need new seeds, maybe, which are heat tolerant, drought tolerant. We need new farming practices. We need a variety of new technologies. And India is not just investing adequately.
That's right. And I think that this is a
And
very valid point that you make, that MSP is only one small part of the pie. And we actually need modernization of agriculture at a pace at which it's not happening and investments are not coming in, and also increasing productivity per worker, which is skilling of the worker himself or herself. I think those are areas that we need to look at. But I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned, which is about how the farmers in Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh have cornered a large proportion I mean, most of the procurement happens from there, and this is a story that you keep hearing in the newspapers, and certainly when the farm laws happened the first time, that this is a northern Indian problem. Like, you see, the farmers in the south are not protesting, and of course, paddy is also grown in the south, but the farmers are not protesting. But this is a North Indian farmer problem. And I want you to help our listeners and me understand this, that is this a Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh problem of farmers who have been used to MSP and so demanding it, and or is it more national?
I think in terms of returns from agriculture or viability of agriculture, in terms of economic returns, Punjab is probably the state with the highest income, per capita income or annual income from agriculture. And I think this was, I wouldn't use the term corner, because this was part and parcel of a package of policies that were introduced in the mid 60s. And the farmers of Punjab did respond to this policy package and increase production of rice and wheat, which was required for the country. But at the same time, not just MSP, but related policies were not very effective in many other parts of the country. So one of the suggestions made by this long-term committee on long-term grain policy was that we have to expand decentralized procurement. And in the last decade or so, this has happened. So in the case of wheat, Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh have become important new centers of procurement. In the case of rice, Andhra Pradesh was always important. Now Odisha has also become important. And Tamil Nadu and Kerala at the state governments are also procuring. So this idea that we need to expand procurement geographically and from continue, but expand to other crops. So I think if I can use a different phrase, we defend the gains and extend the gains. So it's not that we give to the farmers of Bihar by taking away from the farmers of Punjab, or give to the farmers of northern Karnataka by taking away from those of Andhra. But it is that the procurement policies through which MSP was implemented has been concentrated in certain regions and certain crops. And the MSP is announced for 23 crops. Recently, I was at a conference of cotton growers. Only about 8 to 10% of cotton and 8 to 10% of soya bean is procured by state agencies, and only this proportion of farmers get the MSP. All those who sell outside the procurement agency, sell in the private market, are getting a lower price.
A lower price.
So I think this is a very important point, that in many states of India where people are not aware of MSP, but if they're getting a market price which is better than MSP, we don't have to worry about that.
Absolutely.
But we have research showing that, with official statistics, that over the last 10 or 20 years, the gap between what is announced as MSP for dals, for oil seeds, for sugarcane, not just for rice and wheat, the gap between the price announced as MSP and the price actually realized by the farmer in the market on average is growing. So I think this is another reason for saying make MSP statutory, so that over time, again, it will not be an overnight change, but as farmers get aware, as traders are informed that this is the minimum price, I think the proportion of farmers who can sell at that minimum price, either to the state agency or to the private trader, will increase.
So just to understand the proposal, so it's a statutory MSP for paddy and wheat, or for all 23 crops?
For all 23 crops.
For all 23 crops, and the price itself will be decided on a yearly basis through some mechanism.
Yes.
Right.
That's
So just I'm actually quite curious about the data that you just mentioned, that particularly cotton that farmers are selling in the private market at a rate that's lower than the MSP, and also that this gap is growing in many areas. So maybe just by extension, I'm not an economist, but this was somewhere the drift of the farm laws, now withdrawn farm laws, that let the free market operate, right? In that the free market will operate and the farmers will not have to depend on a local arhatia, and will be able to now directly sell to from farm to factory, and maybe will get a better price. So in your sense, as in, would that be a direction of reform that you think has some potential for certain crops, or do you think that it's a good thing that we have now closed that chapter, and now the conversation has moved towards forms of public support for what is a critical sector?
See, the three farm laws, the one we dealt with marketing and the fact that you would not have to sell in these official mandis, as APMCs. that itself was so flawed because so many states don't have APMC or have withdrawn APMC. These are state level acts. That was one issue that came up, of course, the relationship between the state and the center taking over some of the prerogatives of the state. But I think we have a very big private sector in India. Even in rice and wheat, the major part of the crop is sold in the private sector. And so I think the question or the fear that having a guaranteed minimum price would imply that all farmers would have to sell their crop in the APMC or official mandi to the state is very far-fetched. So from having a minimum price, I think the question is that it's a price which gives a minimum return, and private players are also expected to pay this price. In fact, I would like to mention one more suggestion that we made in that old report, which hopefully is being revived and discussed now. We had some discussions on this whole process of procurement and whether it should only be done by the state players, the FCI or the state civil supplies organizations. And there was a discussion about, these government agencies are not great at marketing and they may be corrupt and so on. So one of the issues that came up and that we said is we can have private players engage in procurement. And as happens in many other countries, not just in agriculture, but we had looked at the government of Canada, you may use private players for actual purchase or procurement, but the private player has to pay the assured price. So if a big company like ITC or Reliance is ready to procure for government and then package the rest and sell it under their brand, they are free to do so, but it has to assure the minimum price. So I think there's a misconception that having a legal MSP would mean, some kind of nationalization of trade, which is not the case. We had nationalization of the food trade many years ago, but I think this is not the situation today and is unlikely to be, any time in the near future. I think we are largely a private market economy.
No, that's right. And I think that's an interesting suggestion that we can unbundle it in such a way that we don't need to think about monopoly over procurement as in belonging to the government, as long as the assured price is paid by whoever it is that is procuring. I think that's certainly a suggestion that's worth considering. But let me turn to another area which has been the focus of a lot of your work, which is the role of women, particularly the role of women in the workforce and also particularly in the farm sector. And this has but in the lead up to the general elections, we see that women have become a major voting constituency, and every state has a slew of welfare programs that are directed at women, many of whom are in the workforce. So I just want to start by generally asking you in terms of the role of women in the farm sector. So if you could give us a little bit of a 101 on that, and how do you see the role of women in the farm sector in India, and how has it changed over the years?
I think women are uh, very central to the agricultural uh, households. And I would say here we should look not just at crop farming, but livestock rearing. We find from our studies that if there is a household that owns a cow or a buffalo, invariably it's the woman who is feeding the animal, clearing the dung, bathing the cow, milking it, and so on. So women are very central, I think, to the agricultural system as a whole. But in official statistics, they are not counted adequately. And as a result of which, I think their work is undervalued. And I believe very strongly that not just for the Indian rural economy, but for the Indian economy, unless working women are fully participating in it, we're not going to become a developed economy. When we look at official statistics, women in the workforce in India is much, much lower than almost every country of the world. even compared to our neighbors like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. And this is partly, of course, because of the way the data is collected. And, when an investigator goes and asks a woman, are you a worker? She says, no, 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 I'm just doing work around my home. I'm not really a worker. So one of the ways that is used internationally, and we did a small study in India, in some villages of Karnataka, is what is called a time use survey. So we don't say, are you a worker? But we say, what were you doing from the time you woke up till you went to bed? And we list their activities, and then the researcher classifies them. How many of these are economic activities, and how many of these are very important care activities?
What did you typically find if you were to give me an example from that study?
From that study, what we find is that using the definition of the International Labour Office, every woman in the two villages is a worker. And here I mean in economic activity, because there's very important work that women do in care and maintenance of the household and children and reproductive labor. That's very important. But for our purpose, I'm using only what is officially called economic activity. And the average hours of work per week in economic activity is about 60 hours a week. And if you add care work, it's about 80 hours a week. And the third very important point, I think, is this fluctuates a lot over the year. So we interviewed some of these women in 3 seasons: the sowing season, the harvest season, and the lean season, because there is a cycle of activity in agriculture. And in the lean season, the number of women engaged in economic activity is lower. The number of hours worked in economic activity is lower. But that reflects the lack of suitable work. Whereas in the harvest season, every woman is engaged in economic activity. So I would turn this question around and say, it's not that women in India are not willing to work in economic activity, and therefore they're officially not workers, but it is the lack of suitable employment opportunities. So there is a crisis of employment, of not having employment. And this is particularly so for the younger women who are educated, who want skilled employment. They don't want the same employment in the in the fields as their mothers or their elder women in the village. So it is a crisis of not having employment, as a result of which some women report themselves as not in the workforce, and then we undervalue their work. So this becomes a kind of cycle of not recognizing women's work, not valuing it, and then not providing, not seeing that we need to provide new employment opportunities.
And how do you see these new employment opportunities emerging? Do you see that there is a need for, again, active government intervention in this regard? Do you see it emerging organically as women become more literate and educated and more assertive? Where do you see the source of these new economic activities coming from?
I think that's a very big question and a very difficult question, uh, because there's such a unemployment is on such a large scale in India. Even the men are unemployed. So what we find is, for women who want to leave agricultural labor, particularly since a large part of it remains quite drudgerous. We have mechanization that displaces labor, but there's still a lot of drudgery involved in physical labor. There's very little non-agricultural employment. And if there is any non-agricultural employment, it's the men who take it first. So I think this is part of a bigger crisis of employment in India, that when there's suitable non-agricultural employment, men take it. And I think for women, in addition to non-availability, there's also a question, no doubt, in India about safety, about transport for regular commuting. It's not so easy for women to travel long distances to work every day, to commute, as many men from rural India do. So I think that how to create more jobs, I think we need a second podcast on that, because that's a very, very big issue. But I think here again, the point I'm saying is that when there are new jobs, it's in non-agriculture, it's the men who get it.
That's right. That's right. And I think that
And
that is somewhere as an intuitive as well, because as you said, maybe there are certain conditions that are more suitable for men to take up newer opportunities than women, or maybe something cultural there that's going on. But I was looking at the 2023 periodic labor force survey, and I saw that there has been a 4% increase in the female participation in the labor force, but this has been skewed. While there has been a decrease of percentage of participation of women in rural areas, and particularly amongst scheduled tribes and scheduled caste communities, there has been an increase of participation of women in urban areas, and including those with graduate level education. So do you see that there is a intersectionality has a role to play here in terms of women who are doubly disadvantaged, particularly in the farm sector, as in rural women, perhaps not with the same level of education, are not getting, I mean, even if these new jobs are coming to some women, it's not coming to women who are either from marginalized communities or those in the remote rural areas of the country.
yes, we have seen some very surprising results in the last year, as you said. There seems to be a sudden increase, as per the official statistics, in women's work participation.
That is an important caveat in this day and age.
Yes. And when we look at the rural women, the increase has been in the category which is called own account worker or unpaid worker in family enterprise. So basically, more and more women own account are working on their own farm or taking care of their own animals, and they're unpaid helpers again in a family enterprise, which could be a farm enterprise or sericulture enterprise or dairy enterprise or some. So this, I think, reflects uh, distress among women. There are no regular or casual jobs available to women. And we know that with COVID, men have lost jobs, that we don't have year to year data, but there's no doubt we know that there was a crisis, household incomes declined. And so women are wanting to participate more in the workforce, but there are no suitable employment opportunities, as I mentioned to you. And in the rural areas, the women are working on their own farm or family. Maybe they have, 10 chickens instead of 3 chickens. They're somehow trying to uh, gain more income for the family. Uh, and in the urban areas too, I think there has been, uh, with COVID, a reduction in incomes for a vast section of the population. And this, perhaps the fact that the new women are entering these new jobs reflects that need to earn more. So I would, I think, wait for another round to see whether this data continues this trend. But I think one way of interpreting this is really that, the post-COVID situation, uh, women are seeking jobs. And if they get jobs, they're taking them. And in rural areas where they're not getting these regular jobs, they're trying to engage in various kinds of small petty activities, self-employment activities to raise family income.
That's right. And in the absence of new jobs being created, perhaps that's one of the reasons why we've seen these slew of welfare schemes being announced, because you are trying to then divide up that pie in many ways, because the pie in different ways, because the pie is not expanding. But it is a limited pie. And if we are trying to we are going to have a statutory MSP, it's going to come from the same pie. If you're going to have some direct benefit transfer directly to women, it will also come from the same pie. It's not as if that pie is expanding in any way. So given that these plethora of choices that are available to a policymaker, who it essentially wants to ensure that there is continued government support to the farm sector and particularly to women as well, uh, how should a policymaker look to prioritize within this? And if you were giving them some advice, how would you look at prioritization of welfare within this limited pool that we have?
I think the first and very, very important point is the pie is not fixed. And I think it is a tendency of many economists to start with. This is the pie. And so if I give you a monthly pension of 500 rupees for the woman head of household or for some other category, I'll have to take away from the farmer's MSP. Arghya, over the last couple of decades, various taxes in India, taxes on the rich, the wealth tax, the inheritance tax, all these have been done away with. Corporate tax has been reduced, all kinds of loopholes for income tax. So our tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world.
That's right.
And countries which we think of as totally market economies, like say Germany or Sweden, 40 to 50% of their GDP comes through tax and is in the hands of the government, which can then allocate it to various parts of the economy. So I think it's very, very important that we have to raise our tax revenues in a progressive way through income tax by taxing the richer part of the population. But at the same time, whatever the tax revenues, I think we will have a priority setting to do. I think for me, in the long term, it is not going to be through, let's say, unskilled employment as in NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee. I think we could even take those resources and use them for skilled employment for women in rural areas. So I think we can restructure some of these existing schemes rather than saying it will be a handout or it will be for the most unskilled and laborious work under the hot sun on a construction site. We can do construction better with machinery, and then we can use those resources to actually create skilled employment, say, in the livestock sector for women. So I think we can think of ways in which even the current pie can be redistributed. But I would say it's very, very important to increase the pie.
That's right, and I think that's a really good optimistic thought to leave this on, that this pie, or given the current atmosphere we are in, maybe the roti is not limited, and it can expand, and we need to take steps to actively make it expand rather than see it always as a zero sum game. But I must end on a more personal note. Congratulations to the whole family on your father, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, being given the Bharat Ratna. It's a matter of great honor that the father of the Green Revolution has been awarded in this manner. But I just want you to reflect on that, because this is a poignant moment for Indian agriculture, and much of which is a direct legacy of his work. And if he were alive today, and this is of course a hypothetical, you won't know what he said, but if he were around, what would be his advice to policymakers, to young voters who are thinking about the farm sector? How would he have thought about it if you were to speculate?
I won't say what would he have said now, but I'll say what he has said in the past, in the last few years. He was very concerned about youth in agriculture, because he could see that with agriculture becoming less and less remunerative, especially in relation to other parts of the economy, I think that relative income is very important. Seeing agriculture also becoming more and more risky climate change, he was very concerned that we would not have a next generation of people invested in agriculture. And I think that was one of the very, very deep concerns, and reason for him thinking not about crop yield alone or not about aggregate production alone, but about farmers' welfare. He wanted to ensure, and he would have liked an emphasis to remain in national policy making and in I think, the conversations of our young people in the country about how do we ensure that agriculture is remunerative and that young people would like to be engaged in agriculture.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful thought to end it on, that we we do need to first visibilize our farmers, and I think that this is something that has willy-nilly happened through the farm protest, but needs to sustain. That this is the food on our table doesn't come magically; it comes because of someone working, many people working very hard and toiling under the sun. And we also need to think about welfare of human beings, farmers as human beings, not just technical issues of crop yields and so on, but fundamentally about their lives and their prosperity, because it's in their prosperity that we prosper. So I think that's a great thought to end this on. Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan, for that real tour de force of the Indian farm sector over the last 60-70 years, and where we are today. We are at an inflection point, and I hope we take the calls that the committee that you were a part of and that you today recommended, and that the farm sector remains the foundation for India prospering. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. It was nice talking to you.
As we close, it's time for Free and Fair, our special audience poll where you, as a listener, get to exercise your franchise. Today's question: is it time for India to relook the policy of a minimum support price for certain crops? Vote yes or no. To cast your vote, visit my Twitter account, Arghya_Justify, or Vidhi's LinkedIn account. You have 48 hours. Adjourned.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, follow us on Twitter at Vidhi_India for regular updates. We are on SoundCloud and Spotify as Vidhi Center for Legal Policies podcast. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts or iTunes. Email us at justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in to share your comments and feedback on this episode.